When most people hear the name Scott Peterson, they think they already know the story. A pregnant wife disappears. A secret affair comes to light. A husband becomes the prime suspect. The narrative is clean, linear, and emotionally satisfying. An affair explains everything. A single betrayal becomes the motive for a devastating crime. But human behavior, especially extreme behavior, rarely emerges from a single moment or a single relationship. This documentary begins where the familiar story ends. Because when we move beyond the well-worn narrative of infidelity and look closely at Scott Peterson's romantic history as a pattern, a far more complex psychological portrait begins to emerge. One that is not defined by passion, rage, or sudden moral collapse, but by emotional distance, avoidance, and a lifelong inability to attach in a meaningful way. This is not the story of a man who snapped. It is the story of a man who never fully connected. To understand Scott Peterson's actions, we must first understand how he related to people long before Laci Peterson and long before Amber Frey. We must examine the emotional architecture beneath the charm, the attachment style that shaped every relationship he entered and every one he eventually withdrew from. Scott Peterson was often described using the same words over and over again. Charming, easygoing, likable, smooth. These traits appeared consistently across different phases of his life, with different people in different contexts. Teachers, friends, acquaintances, romantic partners. Many recalled him as personable and calm, someone who rarely seemed rattled or emotionally overwhelmed. At first glance, these are positive traits. But in psychological terms, charm can serve more than one function. In securely attached individuals, charm often complements emotional openness. It exists alongside vulnerability, accountability, and mutual emotional exchange. In avoidantly attached individuals, charm often serves a different purpose entirely. It becomes a buffer. Avoidant attachment develops when emotional closeness is not consistently safe, rewarding, or modeled during early development. Children in such environments learn, implicitly, that relying on others emotionally is unreliable, uncomfortable, or unnecessary. As adults, they may appear independent, confident, and emotionally self-contained. But beneath that surface is often a profound discomfort with dependency, intimacy, and emotional exposure. Charm becomes a strategy to engage without attaching. Scott Peterson's early life does not present overt trauma in the way popular narratives often expect. There are no widely documented accounts of extreme abuse or chaos. And that is precisely why attachment patterns can be so easily overlooked. Attachment injury does not require catastrophe. It requires emotional inconsistency. Children do not need perfect parents, but they do need predictable emotional responsiveness. When emotional needs are minimized, dismissed, or subtly discouraged, children adapt. They learn to self-soothe. They learn not to ask for more than is given. And eventually, they learn that closeness feels intrusive rather than comforting. By adulthood, this adaptation looks like emotional strength. In reality, it is emotional distance. Scott Peterson learned early how to perform connection without experiencing it deeply. He learned how to be present without being vulnerable, engaged without being exposed. These skills would later make him appear trustworthy, even dependable, while internally remaining detached. This is not a conscious manipulation in early life. It is a survival strategy that becomes a personality structure. Before Scott Peterson ever met Laci, his romantic history already showed signs of a recurring pattern. Not dramatic breakups, not explosive conflict, but something quieter and more telling. Relationships that began smoothly, progressed quickly, and then emotionally stalled. Former partners described a familiar arc. Scott would initially appear attentive and interested. He was present, charming, and agreeable. He knew how to mirror emotional expectations without offering much of himself in return. But over time, emotional intimacy failed to deepen. This is a hallmark of dismissive avoidant attachment. Avoidant individuals often enjoy the beginning of relationships, the novelty, the structure, the clearly defined roles. Early dating allows for connection without obligation. Emotional depth is implied, but not yet required. The problems begin when intimacy demands consistency, when emotional availability must be sustained, when a partner expects reciprocity, vulnerability, or future planning rooted in shared emotional investment. At that point, avoidant individuals often respond not with confrontation, but with withdrawal. They become harder to reach emotionally, less communicative, more preoccupied with work, hobbies, or external interests. Importantly, this withdrawal is rarely framed as rejection. Instead, it is rationalized. I'm busy. I need space. I don't like drama. Scott Peterson's early romantic relationships followed this script. He did not leave chaos in his wake. He left confusion. Partners were often left unsure of what went wrong. There was no clear betrayal, no obvious cruelty, just a gradual emotional fading. This pattern reveals something crucial. Scott did not seek dominance or control in relationships at this stage. He sought low emotional demand. He gravitated toward relationships that allowed him to maintain autonomy while still receiving companionship, admiration, and social validation. This is not the profile of a man driven by passion. It is the profile of a man managing discomfort. Emotional triangulation without conscious intent. Another notable pattern emerges when examining Scott Peterson's romantic history prior to marriage. Overlapping emotional interests, even when not overtly sexual. Avoidantly attached individuals often struggle to fully disengage from one relationship before initiating another. Not because they crave excess intimacy, but because emotional overlap allows them to avoid the emotional vacuum of being alone. Being alone invites self-reflection. It invites emotional reckoning. Overlapping connections prevent that. Scott's relationships often showed signs of this overlap. Not always physical, but emotional. He maintained options. He kept doors partially open. He avoided emotional finality. This behavior is sometimes misinterpreted as serial infidelity or calculated deception. In reality, it often reflects emotional buffering, ensuring that no single relationship carries enough emotional weight to destabilize the individual if it ends. In this context, romantic partners become interchangeable emotional roles rather than distinct emotional bonds. This is a critical distinction because when people are interchangeable, attachment is shallow by design. The illusion of stability. To outsiders, Scott Peterson appeared stable. He held jobs. He socialized normally. He presented as emotionally even-keeled. There were no obvious warning signs of volatility or dysfunction. But stability without emotional depth is not emotional health. Avoidant attachment often masquerades as maturity. Emotional restraint is praised as composure. Independence is mistaken for self-sufficiency. And emotional distance is interpreted as calm. But beneath that calm is often emotional disengagement. Scott Peterson did not lack intelligence or social awareness. He understood how relationships were supposed to look. He understood expectations. What he lacked was the ability or willingness to emotionally inhabit them. This distinction will become devastatingly important later, because marriage does not cure avoidant attachment. It exposes it. But in Scott's case, compartmentalization appeared to extend beyond practicality into identity. He did not experience his life as a unified emotional narrative. He experienced it as parallel tracks. One track was marriage. Another was personal freedom. Another was external validation. These tracks did not emotionally intersect. This allowed Scott to appear sincere in each context without fully integrating them. To Laci, he was a husband. To friends, he was a relaxed companion. To acquaintances, he was charming and approachable. But none of these roles required him to confront his emotional emptiness. The pregnancy, a psychological shift. When Laci became pregnant, the emotional stakes of the marriage changed fundamentally. For securely attached individuals, pregnancy often intensifies bonding and future orientation. For avoidant individuals, pregnancy can trigger the opposite response. A child represents permanence. It represents irreversible emotional obligation. It represents a future that cannot be easily escaped. Scott Peterson did not outwardly reject the pregnancy. He did not display overt hostility or panic, but subtle behavioral shifts were noted. He became more emotionally distant, more invested in external activities, less engaged in shared planning. This is consistent with avoidant detachment theory. When intimacy becomes unavoidable, avoidant individuals often respond not with confrontation, but with psychological withdrawal. They begin to emotionally exit long before any physical exit occurs. The silence inside the marriage. One of the most revealing aspects of Scott and Laci's relationship is not what was said, but what was never expressed. There is little evidence that Scott openly articulated dissatisfaction, fear, or ambivalence about his life. He did not communicate existential anxiety. He did not articulate doubts about fatherhood. He did not seek renegotiation of the relationship. Instead, he maintained silence. This silence is often misinterpreted as deception, but psychologically, it can represent something deeper: a lack of emotional vocabulary. Avoidant individuals often struggle not because they feel too much, but because they feel too little or cannot access what they feel. Rather than confronting emotional conflict, they default to suppression. But suppressed emotions do not disappear. They accumulate. The myth of the happy marriage. To the outside world, Scott and Laci's marriage appeared successful. They hosted gatherings. They socialized. They projected stability. But projecting stability is not the same as experiencing connection. Many witnesses later described Scott as calm during the early stages of Laci's disappearance. His affect appeared controlled, measured, and emotionally restrained. For some observers, this was suspicious. For others, it was simply his personality. But from an attachment perspective, his demeanor was not new. It was the continuation of a lifelong pattern. Scott Peterson did not suddenly become emotionally detached after Laci disappeared. He had been emotionally detached long before. The psychological function of marriage for Scott. For Scott, marriage served multiple functions. Social legitimacy. Marriage reinforced his identity as a normal, successful adult. Emotional outsourcing. Laci provided emotional energy that Scott did not generate internally. Narrative stability. Marriage created a coherent life story without requiring emotional depth. Avoidance of introspection. The structure of family life reduced the need for self-examination. In this sense, Scott did not use marriage to deepen connection. He used it to avoid confronting his own emotional limitations. The invisible fracture. By the early 2000s, Scott Peterson's life appeared stable on the surface. But psychologically, it was approaching a breaking point. Avoidant individuals can sustain emotional distance for years, sometimes decades, without overt crisis. But when external circumstances demand emotional accountability, the system begins to fail. Laci's pregnancy represented such a demand. It forced Scott to confront a future that required sustained emotional presence. And for someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding emotional attachment, this was not merely uncomfortable. It was destabilizing. When the public learned about Scott Peterson's affair, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The narrative was simple. A man was bored with his marriage. He met another woman. He wanted a different life. But this explanation is psychologically incomplete. Affairs do not always emerge from desire. Sometimes they emerge from avoidance. For Scott Peterson, the affair was not a rupture in his life. It was a logical continuation of a pattern he had been rehearsing for years. Because long before Amber Frey entered his life, Scott had already learned how to live in parallel emotional realities. The psychology of parallel identities. Most people experience their lives as a single narrative. They may behave differently at work than at home, but emotionally, these identities are integrated. Avoidant individuals often operate differently. They divide their emotional world into compartments. One compartment contains obligation. Another contains freedom. Another contains fantasy. These compartments are not emotionally connected. Scott Peterson's life had already been structured this way. Marriage represented obligation. Friendships represented social ease. Personal pursuits represented autonomy. The affair would later become something else entirely, a psychological escape hatch. But the groundwork was laid long before. Cognitive splitting, morality without emotion. One of the most disturbing aspects of Scott Peterson's behavior is not what he did, but how calmly he did it. This calmness is often interpreted as psychopathy. But psychology offers another explanation: cognitive splitting. Cognitive splitting occurs when individuals separate emotional meaning from actions. They understand that something is wrong intellectually, but they do not emotionally experience its weight. Scott Peterson knew adultery was wrong. He knew deception was wrong. He knew betrayal was wrong. But knowing is not the same as feeling. Avoidant individuals often operate with a reduced emotional response to moral conflict. They prioritize internal equilibrium over ethical consistency. The goal is not pleasure. The goal is emotional stability, the performance of normality. Scott Peterson did not behave like a stereotypical adulterer. He did not exhibit reckless impulsivity. He did not openly rebel against domestic life. He did not express overt dissatisfaction with his marriage. Instead, he maintained normality. He attended social events. He interacted with family. He participated in daily routines. This dual performance is psychologically significant. Maintaining normality requires effort. It requires narrative management. It requires emotional suppression. It requires constant role switching. For avoidant individuals, this effort is not exhausting in the way it would be for others, because emotional detachment reduces internal conflict. Scott was not torn between two lives. He simply inhabited whichever life he was in at the moment. The absence of guilt. Guilt is an emotion that arises from attachment. We feel guilty when we fear harming someone to whom we feel emotionally connected. Scott Peterson's behavior suggests not an absence of conscience, but an absence of emotional attachment deep enough to generate guilt. This distinction is crucial. Psychopaths lack empathy. Avoidant individuals restrict attachment. Scott did not appear to derive pleasure from deception. He derived stability from it. The affair allowed him to experience novelty without confronting the emotional demands of fatherhood and long-term intimacy. In this sense, Amber Frey was not a romantic obsession. She was a psychological refuge. The double life as emotional self-regulation. In clinical psychology, individuals develop coping strategies to regulate emotional stress. Some turn to substances. Some turn to work. Some turn to isolation. Scott Peterson turned to duplication. By creating two parallel lives, he could avoid fully inhabiting either one. Marriage demanded emotional presence. The affair demanded emotional performance. Neither demanded authenticity. This is the hidden logic of his behavior. Scott did not want to leave his marriage. He did not want to fully commit to his affair. He wanted to avoid choosing. Choice requires emotional accountability. Avoidance requires only logistics. The role of fantasy. Affairs often involve fantasy. But in Scott Peterson's case, fantasy served a specific psychological function. Fantasy offers emotional intensity without emotional responsibility. With Amber, Scott could craft a narrative that was emotionally rich but structurally fragile. He could present himself as widowed, unattached, and free. This narrative was not just deception. It was rehearsal. Scott was experimenting with an identity unburdened by emotional obligations. But crucially, he did not dismantle his existing life. He duplicated it. Emotional detachment before physical acts. One of the most important insights in understanding Scott Peterson's psychology is timing. Most people assume emotional detachment followed the crime. In reality, emotional detachment preceded it. By the time Laci disappeared, Scott had already psychologically exited the marriage. He had already redefined his emotional priorities. He had already normalized deception. He had already divided his identity. This means the crime, whatever its exact motivations, did not emerge from sudden rage or panic. It emerged from a long process of emotional disengagement. The illusion of control. Scott Peterson's double life gave him a sense of control. He controlled narratives. He controlled information. He controlled emotional exposure. For avoidant individuals, control is not about dominance. It is about safety. Emotional unpredictability is threatening. Structured deception feels safer than emotional confrontation. Scott did not destroy his marriage out of hatred. He avoided confronting it out of fear. When the name Amber Frey enters the Scott Peterson story, the tone changes. Suddenly, the narrative becomes emotional, scandalous, and dramatic. A secret lover, a double life exposed, a man caught between two women. But this framing is misleading, because Amber Frey did not create Scott Peterson's emotional dysfunction. She revealed it. To understand this, we must resist the temptation to personalize the affair. Instead, we must analyze it structurally. Scott's relationship with Amber did not emerge from passion. It emerged from psychological necessity. Why Amber? Amber Frey was not randomly chosen. Avoidant individuals often select partners who satisfy three unconscious criteria: emotional availability without emotional threat, novelty without obligation, admiration without demand. Amber fit these conditions perfectly. She was independent yet receptive, curious yet not intrusive, emotionally expressive yet not embedded in Scott's existing social world. Most importantly, she was external to his marriage. This allowed Scott to construct a parallel emotional reality without destabilizing his primary life, at least initially. The scripted courtship. Scott Peterson did not improvise his relationship with Amber. He scripted it. He told her he had lost his wife. He presented himself as grieving yet composed. He portrayed himself as emotionally available but wounded. This narrative was not accidental. It served multiple psychological functions. It eliminated moral accountability. It justified emotional distance. It generated sympathy and admiration. But most importantly, it allowed Scott to avoid being fully known. If Amber believed he was widowed, she would not ask questions about his marriage. If she believed he was grieving, she would not demand emotional transparency. Scott constructed a relationship that required performance, not intimacy. Performance intimacy versus authentic connection. The relationship between Scott and Amber was intense, but not intimate. Intensity is often mistaken for intimacy, but psychologically, they are opposites. Intimacy requires vulnerability. Intensity requires stimulation. Scott was skilled at creating emotional intensity without emotional exposure. He used language strategically. He mirrored Amber's emotions. He expressed longing without revealing his inner life. This is not unique to criminals. It is a common pattern among avoidant individuals who have learned how to simulate connection without inhabiting it. Amber experienced closeness. Scott experienced control. The role of deception. Scott Peterson's deception has often been interpreted as pathological lying. But his lies were not chaotic. They were coherent. They followed a narrative logic. He did not lie to confuse others. He lied to stabilize his emotional environment. Truth would have forced him to confront competing emotional demands. Deception allowed him to maintain separation between his identities. In this sense, lying was not impulsive. It was structural. The affair as a psychological rehearsal. Scott's relationship with Amber was not merely an affair. It was a rehearsal of an alternative life. In that alternative life, he was unattached. He was emotionally expressive without accountability. He was free from paternal responsibility. This alternative identity was emotionally intoxicating precisely because it was unreal. But Scott did not dismantle his real life. He layered fantasy on top of reality. This layering is a hallmark of avoidant attachment. Avoidant individuals do not replace relationships. They stack them. Why the affair did not lead to separation? A crucial question remains. If Scott was unhappy in his marriage, why didn't he leave? The answer is psychological, not moral. Leaving requires confrontation. It requires admitting dissatisfaction. It requires negotiating conflict. It requires accepting emotional consequences. Avoidant individuals often prefer deception to confrontation. Confrontation threatens their internal equilibrium. Deception preserves it. Scott did not leave Laci because leaving would have required emotional honesty. He was not prepared for that. The moment the system failed, Scott Peterson's psychological system depended on secrecy. As long as his identities remained separate, he could function. But secrecy is fragile. When Laci disappeared, Scott's compartments collided. The affair was exposed. His narrative collapsed. His emotional detachment became visible. At that moment, the affair stopped being a private coping mechanism. It became public evidence. But by then, the psychological damage had already been done. Amber as a mirror, not a cause. Amber Frey did not change Scott Peterson. She mirrored him. Through her, we see how Scott constructed relationships. Emotional closeness without accountability. Narrative control without authenticity. Connection without attachment. Amber's presence did not destabilize Scott. Exposure did. When people hear the word manipulation, they imagine intent. A person who plots. A person who strategizes. A person who deliberately deceives for personal gain. But manipulation does not always begin with malice. Sometimes it begins with fear. For Scott Peterson, manipulation was not merely a tool to exploit others. It was a mechanism to stabilize himself. To understand his behavior, we must shift perspective. Scott Peterson did not manipulate because he enjoyed controlling people. He manipulated because he could not tolerate emotional exposure. The function of control. Emotional intimacy is unpredictable. It demands responsiveness. It exposes vulnerability. It requires accountability. For avoidant individuals, unpredictability is threatening. Control becomes a substitute for connection. By controlling narratives, Scott could avoid confronting emotional realities. He could decide what others knew. He could decide how he was perceived. He could decide which version of himself existed in each relationship. This was not grandiosity. It was emotional management. Language as a weapon and a shield. Scott Peterson's manipulation was subtle. He did not shout. He did not dominate conversations. He did not dramatize conflict. Instead, he used language strategically. He spoke calmly. He avoided emotionally charged statements. He reframed situations to minimize conflict. When questioned, he responded with measured neutrality. This communication style served two purposes. It prevented emotional escalation. It preserved his psychological distance. Scott did not argue. He deflected. Narrative engineering. One of Scott Peterson's most distinctive traits was narrative control. He did not simply lie. He constructed stories. With Laci, the story was normalcy. With Amber, the story was loss and longing. With friends, the story was casual stability. Each story was internally consistent, but none were fully true. Scott's genius, if it can be called that, was not deception. It was coherence. His lies were believable because they were emotionally plausible. The emotional economy of lying. Most people lie to avoid consequences. Scott Peterson lied to avoid emotions. Truth would have forced him to confront conflicting roles. Truth would have required him to admit dissatisfaction, fear, or moral conflict. Lies allowed him to maintain equilibrium. This is why his deception was sustained, not sporadic. It was not reactive. It was systemic. Manipulation without sadism. Popular culture often portrays manipulators as sadistic. They enjoy hurting others. They relish power. They display cruelty. Scott Peterson did not fit this archetype. He did not appear sadistic. He did not display overt aggression. He did not seek humiliation of others. His manipulation was emotionally cold, not emotionally violent. This distinction matters because it suggests that his behavior was not driven by hatred, but by emptiness. The failure of emotional signals. In healthy relationships, emotional signals guide behavior. Guilt prompts repair. Empathy prompts restraint. Attachment prompts protection. Scott Peterson's emotional signaling system appeared impaired, not absent. Impaired. He understood intellectually that his actions were wrong, but the emotional feedback that might have stopped him was weak. This is not psychopathy. It is emotional disconnection, when control becomes necessity. As Laci's pregnancy progressed and Scott's affair deepened, his system of control became increasingly fragile. The more complex his life became, the harder it was to maintain narrative coherence. Each lie required another lie. Each compartment required stronger boundaries. Control was no longer optional. It was necessary, and necessity breeds desperation. The PRE crisis state. By late 2002, Scott Peterson's psychological structure was under strain. He was balancing a pregnant wife expecting emotional presence, a secret relationship requiring emotional performance, a public identity demanding normality. These demands were incompatible. For most people, such tension would lead to confession, separation, or emotional breakdown. For Scott, it led to silence. And silence is often the most dangerous response. Transition to Part 6. In Part 6, we will enter the most critical phase of Scott Peterson's psychological journey: emotional detachment turning into decision collapse. We will examine how avoidant attachment, narrative control, and emotional emptiness converged into a point of no return, not as a sudden explosion, but as a quiet, irreversible psychological shutdown. Psychological shutdown is not a dramatic event. It is a gradual withdrawal from emotional engagement. Signs include reduced emotional responsiveness, flattened affect, increased reliance on routine, moral disengagement. Witnesses later described Scott as calm, controlled, and emotionally neutral. But neutrality is not innocence. It can be the absence of emotional connection. Scott was not processing the emotional implications of his situation. He was bypassing them. Moral disengagement. Moral disengagement occurs when individuals disconnect actions from ethical consequences. It does not require cruelty. It does not require hatred. It requires distance. Scott Peterson had already distanced himself emotionally from Laci. Once emotional distance is established, moral obligations weaken. This does not make violence inevitable, but it makes previously unthinkable options psychologically conceivable. In Scott's case, emotional detachment did not create anger. It created indifference, and indifference is often more dangerous than anger. The loss of future orientation. Another crucial shift occurred in Scott's psychology: the collapse of future-oriented thinking. Healthy individuals imagine their future in relational terms. Family, children, shared identity. Scott's future imagination had shifted. His envisioned future no longer included Laci in an emotionally meaningful way. Instead, it was abstract, fragmented, and centered on personal autonomy. When individuals lose relational future orientation, they lose a key moral anchor. The future becomes something to escape toward, not build together. Decision without drama. Popular narratives assume that catastrophic decisions are accompanied by emotional turmoil. But Scott Peterson's psychological state suggests the opposite. There is no evidence of dramatic emotional struggle, no evidence of confession attempts, no evidence of emotional negotiation. Instead, there is evidence of cognitive resolution. When avoidant individuals reach cognitive resolution, they stop feeling conflicted. They stop oscillating. They move forward with chilling calm. Scott Peterson did not act in a moment of passion. He acted after emotional meaning had already disappeared. The disappearance as psychological reveal. When Laci Peterson disappeared, the world searched for external explanations. Kidnapping, random violence, strangers. But psychologically, the disappearance revealed something internal. Scott's emotional detachment became visible. His reactions were measured. His language was controlled. His affect was restrained. To some, this was suspicious. To others, it was simply his personality. But from an attachment perspective, it was neither. It was the final stage of emotional disengagement. Scott was not pretending to feel less. He genuinely felt less. The aftermath of detachment. In the days following Laci's disappearance, Scott's behavior followed a consistent pattern. He cooperated selectively. He avoided emotional displays. He maintained narrative control. These behaviors were not new. They were intensified versions of lifelong coping strategies. Scott was not improvising. He was operating according to a psychological blueprint he had been developing for decades. The dangerous normality. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Scott Peterson's psychological collapse is how normal it appeared. There were no dramatic warning signs, no visible breakdown, no explosive conflict. From the outside, his life looked stable, but stability without attachment is fragile. And when it breaks, it does not shatter loudly. It collapses silently. When the case against Scott Peterson entered the courtroom, something unusual happened. The trial was not driven only by forensic evidence. It was driven by emotion. Not the emotions of the victims, not the emotions of the public, but the absence of emotion in the defendant. From the moment Scott appeared before cameras, investigators, and jurors, a silent question dominated the room. Why doesn't he look like a grieving husband? In criminal trials, facts determine guilt, but emotions shape belief. And Scott Peterson's emotional detachment became one of the most powerful forces in the courtroom. The expectation of grief. Society has unwritten rules about grief. A husband whose pregnant wife disappears is expected to display visible distress, emotional volatility, desperation, urgency. When those signals are missing, suspicion emerges. Scott Peterson did not perform grief in a recognizable way. He did not collapse emotionally in public. He did not display uncontrolled anger or despair. He did not appear frantic. Instead, he appeared controlled, measured, detached. To the public, this looked unnatural. To psychologists, it looked familiar. Affect versus guilt. One of the most misunderstood aspects of criminal behavior is affect. Affect refers to outward emotional expression. Low affect does not necessarily indicate guilt. High affect does not necessarily indicate innocence. But juries are human. They interpret emotion intuitively, not clinically. Scott's flat affect became symbolic. It suggested indifference. It suggested calculation. It suggested emotional coldness. In the courtroom, perception often matters as much as evidence. Scott Peterson did not merely stand trial for a crime. He stood trial for his personality. The problem with normality. Scott's defense argued that his demeanor reflected his personality, not his guilt. He had always been calm. He had always been reserved. He had never been emotionally expressive. This argument is psychologically plausible, but it failed socially. Because in moments of tragedy, society expects emotional deviation from baseline behavior. When tragedy does not disrupt emotional presentation, people interpret it as abnormal. Scott did not become more emotional after Laci disappeared. He remained the same, and that constancy became suspicious. Micro-behaviors under scrutiny. Every gesture Scott made was analyzed. His tone of voice, his posture, his eye contact, his pauses. Prosecutors and commentators interpreted these micro-behaviors as signs of deception. But micro-behaviors are ambiguous. Avoidant individuals often display reduced emotional expressiveness, controlled speech patterns, limited emotional vocabulary, minimal facial effect. These traits can resemble guilt, but they can also reflect personality structure. The courtroom is not designed to distinguish between the two. The role of Amber Frey in court. When the affair was revealed, the psychological narrative shifted. Scott was no longer just a detached husband. He became a double-life figure. The affair confirmed what many already suspected emotionally. If he could deceive one woman, perhaps he could destroy another. But this logic is emotional, not legal. Affairs are common. Homicide is not. Yet in the courtroom, the affair became symbolic evidence of character. Scott was no longer judged only for what he did. He was judged for who he seemed to be. Character on trial. In theory, criminal trials focus on actions. In practice, they often focus on identity. The prosecution constructed a narrative. Scott Peterson was a man who wanted freedom, a man who resented fatherhood, a man who chose escape over responsibility. The defense attempted a counter-narrative. Scott Peterson was emotionally reserved, not murderous. Detached, not violent. Flawed, but not criminal. The jury was asked to decide between two psychological stories. Evidence mattered, but stories persuaded. The dangerous power of emotional interpretation. Humans are wired to interpret emotional cues. We trust those who cry. We distrust those who remain calm. But this instinct is unreliable. Some innocent people are emotionally numb. Some guilty people are emotionally expressive. Scott Peterson's trial demonstrates a disturbing truth. In the absence of definitive emotional signals, society fills the gap with suspicion. Scott did not cry enough. He did not panic enough. He did not break down enough. And so the public concluded, he must be hiding something. Detachment as a liability. Ironically, the very traits that helped Scott navigate his life became liabilities in court. His calm became incriminating. His control became suspicious. His silence became evidence. Avoidant attachment, which had protected him from emotional vulnerability, now exposed him to moral judgment. Scott did not understand this. He did not adapt his emotional performance. He remained himself, and in a courtroom that demanded emotional authenticity that was fatal. The jury's dilemma. Jurors faced a complex task. They were instructed to focus on evidence, but they were surrounded by emotional signals. They had to reconcile forensic data, witness testimony, behavioral interpretation, their own instincts. Scott's emotional detachment became a lens through which all evidence was interpreted. Neutral facts appeared sinister. Ambiguous actions appeared calculated. Once a narrative forms, evidence follows it, not the other way around. When confronting extreme crimes, society searches for labels. Monster, psychopath, narcissist, sociopath. Labels offer emotional clarity. They allow us to separate ourselves from the perpetrator. They create distance between us and him. But psychology is rarely that simple. To understand Scott Peterson, we must resist the temptation of easy diagnoses and examine three competing frameworks. Attachment theory, narcissistic personality traits, antisocial, sociopathic tendencies. The question is not which label fits best. The question is which framework explains his behavior most accurately. Attachment theory, the avoidant profile. Attachment theory focuses on how individuals form emotional bonds. Scott Peterson's behavioral pattern aligns strongly with dismissive avoidant attachment. Key traits include emotional distance in close relationships, discomfort with dependency, suppression of emotional needs, preference for autonomy over intimacy. Scott's relationships showed consistent signs of these traits. He avoided confrontation. He avoided emotional vulnerability. He avoided deep attachment. Avoidant individuals do not seek emotional chaos. They seek emotional minimalism. Scott Peterson's life can be interpreted as a lifelong attempt to minimize emotional demand. Narcissism. Did Scott fit the profile? Narcissism is often misunderstood. It is not simply arrogance or vanity. Clinically, narcissistic traits include grandiosity, need for admiration, lack of empathy, sense of entitlement. Scott Peterson displayed some narcissistic features. He enjoyed admiration. He curated his image. He lied to preserve his self-concept. But he did not display classic narcissistic grandiosity. He did not seek fame. He did not dominate social spaces. He did not demand constant attention. His behavior was not driven by superiority. It was driven by avoidance. Narcissists crave attention. Scott avoided emotional exposure. This distinction is critical. Sociopathy. Was Scott a psychopath? Sociopathy, or antisocial personality disorder, is characterized by chronic rule-breaking, impulsivity, aggression, lack of remorse, exploitation of others. Scott Peterson did not fit this profile cleanly. He was not impulsive. He was not chaotic. He was not overtly aggressive. His behavior was controlled, calculated, and socially conforming. Psychopaths often seek thrill. Scott sought stability. Psychopaths often enjoy risk. Scott avoided it. This suggests that sociopathy alone cannot explain his behavior. The hybrid model, avoidance with narcissistic defenses. The most accurate psychological interpretation of Scott Peterson may be a hybrid model. Core, avoidant attachment, supplemented by narcissistic defense mechanisms. Without full sociopathy. In this model, avoidance explains emotional detachment. Narcissistic traits explain image management. Moral disengagement explains ethical collapse. Scott was not a monster in the cinematic sense. He was a man whose emotional architecture was fundamentally incompatible with deep intimacy. Empathy, absent or restricted. A key question is empathy. Did Scott lack empathy entirely? The evidence suggests not absence, but restriction. He demonstrated cognitive empathy. He understood how others felt. He predicted emotional reactions. He adapted his behavior accordingly. But effective empathy, feeling others' emotions, appeared limited. This is common in avoidant individuals. They understand emotions intellectually, but do not experience them deeply. This makes them appear cold. But coldness is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is emotional poverty, the dangerous normality. Perhaps the most unsettling conclusion is this. Scott Peterson was not psychologically exotic. His traits exist on a spectrum. Avoidant attachment is common. Narcissistic defenses are common. Emotional suppression is common. What made Scott dangerous was not uniqueness. It was accumulation. Avoidance plus deception plus moral disengagement plus escalating pressure. Under extreme conditions, ordinary psychological mechanisms can produce extraordinary outcomes. This is what makes the case so disturbing. Why simple labels fail? Calling Scott Peterson a psychopath is emotionally satisfying. It allows us to believe his actions came from a rare pathology. But psychology suggests something more troubling. He may have been psychologically ordinary until circumstances forced his emotional system beyond its limits. This does not excuse his actions. It complicates them. After the investigation, after the trial, after the headlines faded, one question remains unanswered. Did Scott Peterson ever truly love anyone? Not in the romantic sense, not in the performative sense, but in the psychological sense of attachment. Because if his relationships were built on avoidance, performance, and emotional distance, then the tragedy of this case may be deeper than violence. It may be emotional emptiness. To answer this question, we must step beyond crime and enter the most uncomfortable territory of psychology. What does attachment really mean? Attachment is not affection. It is not charm. It is not commitment on paper. Attachment is emotional dependency combined with emotional responsibility. It means another person's existence changes your internal world. Their pain feels real to you. Their future matters to you. By this definition, attachment is not measured by words. It is measured by sacrifice. Scott Peterson and the illusion of love. Scott Peterson's relationships were filled with signals that resembled love. He married. He socialized. He expressed affection. He planned a future. But psychology distinguishes between relational behavior and relational attachment. Scott performed relational behavior, but performance is not proof of attachment. Throughout his life, Scott maintained proximity without vulnerability. He stayed close without letting anyone inside. This is the signature of avoidant attachment. Did he ever attach to Laci? If Scott had been deeply attached to Laci, certain psychological signals would likely have appeared. Emotional panic after her disappearance. Visible grief. Breakdown of emotional control. Instead, we saw restraint. But restraint alone does not prove detachment. Some people grieve quietly, so we must look deeper. Scott's behavior suggested not suppressed grief, but limited emotional investment. He behaved as if Laci's disappearance disrupted his logistics more than his identity. This is a brutal observation, but it aligns with the psychological pattern we have traced. Did he ever attach to Amber? Scott's relationship with Amber was intense, but intensity is not attachment. Attachment requires risk. Scott never risked his emotional autonomy with Amber. He controlled the narrative. He curated his identity. He withheld truth. This is not attachment. It is simulation. Amber was not a partner. She was a psychological experiment. Did he ever attach to anyone? To answer this, we must examine Scott's emotional architecture. Avoidant individuals do not lack the capacity for attachment. They fear it. They suppress it. They minimize it. Scott may have experienced moments of connection, but he never allowed those moments to become defining. He chose autonomy over intimacy every time. Over years, this choice became identity. By the time crisis arrived, attachment was no longer accessible to him. The most unsettling possibility, the most disturbing conclusion is not that Scott Peterson was evil. It is that he was emotionally absent. Evil implies passion. Hatred implies intensity. Revenge implies feeling. Scott's actions suggest something colder. A man who did not feel enough to stop himself. This is not psychopathy. It is emotional vacuum. What his case teaches us. Scott Peterson's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human relationships. Love is not guaranteed by marriage. Charm is not proof of empathy. Stability is not proof of attachment. Most importantly, emotional avoidance is not harmless. In extreme cases, it can destroy lives. Scott Peterson did not wake up one day and become a monster. He slowly erased emotional meaning from his relationships. By the time meaning disappeared, morality followed. The final verdict. So, was Scott Peterson ever attached? The answer is not yes or no. He was attached in form, but not in depth. He participated in relationships without inhabiting them. He lived among people without fully connecting to them. In psychological terms, he was present but absent. Closing monologue, cinematic ending. We often believe that the most dangerous people are those who feel too much. But sometimes, the most dangerous people are those who feel too little. Scott Peterson's story is not only a crime story. It is a warning. A warning about what happens when emotional avoidance becomes a way of life. Because when connection disappears, conscience weakens. And when conscience weakens, anything becomes possible. The tragedy is not only what he did. The tragedy is that, long before the crime, he had already left emotionally. Long before Laci disappeared, Scott Peterson had already vanished. We often imagine that the most dangerous people are those who feel too much. But sometimes, the most dangerous people are those who feel too little. Scott Peterson did not destroy his family in a moment of rage. He destroyed it slowly, quietly, emotionally, long before the crime ever happened. His story is not only a crime story, it is a psychological warning. Because when emotional connection disappears, morality weakens. And when morality weakens, anything becomes possible. If this documentary changed the way you see true crime, subscribe for more deep psychological breakdowns. And ask yourself one final question. How well do we really know the people closest to us?